Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where y'all are from. Welcome. We're just opening up the webinar now, so come on in. Good morning or afternoon. Gosh, I don't know. Just hello, everybody. Welcome to our Researcher Spotlight. We're going to get started in just a minute. We just want to give folks a chance to come in from the waiting room, and then we will get started. Hello, everyone. I see folks coming on in. We are going to get started in just a minute. We are still letting folks in from the waiting room, but welcome, everyone. Feel free to say hi in the chat if you'd like. Tell us who you are, where you're calling in or zooming in from. And again, we will start in just a minute. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. People can continue to join, but we only have 30 minutes and I want to utilize all of that time here. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to PNPI's Researcher Spotlight today with Dr. Genevieve Garcia Kendrick of the Institute of Higher Education Policy, or IHEP, as you likely know them better as. I'm Betsy Preeter. I recognize a lot of names, so welcome back. I'm the Director of Programming here at PNPI. And just for a little context setting, the goal of this spotlight and all of our researcher spotlights we've done in the last couple of years is really to introduce you to the work of emerging researchers, emerging research in the federal higher education policy space, and give you a chance to just spend a lot of time, 30 minutes of your time digging into one report, really getting to know one researcher. So we're thrilled to welcome you all here today. I'm going to start and just introduce Jen to you all. Then she is going to do an overview of a report she co-authored called Rising Above the Threshold, How to Increase Equitable Post-Secondary Value, and we'll make sure we link it in the chat for all of you. And then as she's presenting, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box. If something pops into your head, get it in there, and then we will have dedicated Q&A time after she's done. So we are happy to entertain any questions you have. The Q&A feature also allows you to upvote questions that you too might want to hear the answer to. So feel free to do that as well. We're going to close the chat feature so that we can direct all questions directly through the Q&A box. So that is our plan for Q&A. And I'll just introduce Jen. So welcome, Jen. For those of you who don't know her yet, Dr. Genevieve Garcia Kendrick is a senior research analyst at the Institute of Higher Education Policy, IHEP. In this role, she conducts research on the value of post-secondary education. And prior to IHEP, she was the director of writing across the curriculum and an assistant professor at Syracuse University. So we welcome Jen to our Researcher Spotlight. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you to tell us about this report, and then I'll be back when we have our conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. I will give one caveat. I am a little congested today, so I apologize if I have to go on mute and take care of that, but it will be great. So I'm going to just share my screen, and then we will chat a little bit about, let's see if I can get this to work. It is, sorry, 1 minute. There we go. Okay. For some reason, it's not going onto slideshow, but that's okay. So I will just do it this way. So again, my name is Genevieve Garcia Kendrick. I am at IHEP. I'm going to talk a little bit about rising above the threshold. First, I want to start with higher education should be a pathway to a better living and a better life for all students, regardless of race, ethnicity, economic background, or gender. But right now, the value delivered to students after high school varies greatly by who a student is and where they come from, and that's not right. If you don't know IHEP, I wanted to share our new vision and our new mission. At Institute for Higher Education Policy, our vision is building a more equitable and just society through higher education. And our mission is we drive systemic change in higher education to advance equitable outcomes and generational impact for communities historically marginalized on the basis of race, ethnicity, or income. We achieve this change through research, advocacy, policy development, and field engagement. I'm just going to try to share this one more time and just let me know if that is working. I think it is now.
Yeah,
there we
good.
go. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Sorry about that, Betsy. So in Rising Above the Threshold, we found that a student's investment in post-secondary education is a key component of determining whether students are receiving a minimum economic return from higher education. We also found that affordability solutions like doubling the Pell Grant and free college programs are indeed one way to improve economic returns for students and help even more students realize the value a post-secondary education can deliver. So student-centered, data-informed, and equity-focused policy can turn the goal of delivering equitable post-secondary value into a reality. So I'm going to go a little bit in terms of background and context, and then into our methodology, focus in on our findings, and then add some recommendations at the end. So the background, this work was brought out of the Post-Secondary Value Commission, where we found that higher education should be a pathway to a better living and a better life. And I want to actually go ahead and define post-secondary value, because one of the main core reasons for the Post-Secondary Value Commission was to really get an understanding of what post-secondary value is. And out of that report, the definition, students experience post-secondary value when provided equitable access and support to complete quality, affordable credentials that offer economic mobility and prepare them to advance racial and economic justice in our society. In that report, we also had an action agenda, and I want to kind of center this work within that work as well. So what we really tried to think about in terms of our audience was institutional leaders, federal policymakers, and then state policymakers. And this key component of the overall commission, this was the first research report to come out of post the commission. And so that's why we focused in on removing that affordability as an impediment to post-secondary value. Also out of the commission, we developed a set of thresholds where we measure economic return. The very first threshold, 0, is what we focused in for this report, which is the minimum economic return. To put that kind of at its base value, we're determining or measuring whether or not students who have a college degree are doing better post-college than if they had never gone to college at all. We also have other kinds of thresholds that we're doing more work on. Threshold 1, earnings premium. So whether a student meets the threshold if they reach at least a medium earnings in their field of study. 2, earnings parity. Threshold 3, economic mobility, and so on. Methodology. So I'm going to go into how we calculated threshold 0, since that's what is most important for this report itself. First, we took the annual net price, the cost of attendance minus average grant aid, and then we multiplied it by an estimate of the number of years it takes to finish a credential. And this amount was amortized over a 10-year period to give an annual figure. So calculating threshold 0 added the annualized student investment amount to the median high school graduate earnings in the same state. And then we compared threshold 0 to student earnings. So we considered a college to provide a minimum economic return if median earnings 10 years after entry meet or exceed threshold 0. It really is probably the most fundamental piece of the project, is constructing school-specific estimates of threshold 0 under the status quo and under hypothetical expansions to existing student aid programs. To calculate the threshold 0, I showed you, and I'm going to actually show you an example in a second. So modeling, after this, we modeled expansions in financial aid, and expansions in existing financial aid programs affect our measure of value by lowering the net price that students pay, and therefore the threshold 0 amount. So the two that we modeled were doubling the Pell and first dollar and last dollar free college. To model doubling the Pell Grant, we refine our calculation of net price. So we first subtract average grant aid from all sources from the institution's cost of attendance, and to calculate this like annual net price. We then subtracted the average Pell Award from the annual net price, which effectively double counts those dollars. And then finally, we use the new net price estimate to compute threshold 0. So here's an example to kind of just put it visually. So sample institution, let's go status quo, 100, first-time full-time undergraduate students. Let's say we'll look at the awards, 1 million in grant aid from all sources, including 500,000 in federal Pell Grants, and then the average grant aid included. And when we do our calculations to understand threshold 0, we've got this 15,000 net price. So ultimately, we're taking threshold 0, we're determining how much aid is reduces the cost of attendance. And so when we're doubling the Pell, right, we're adding in the double dollars for the Pell Grant, and the net price goes down to 10,000. Design also really matters for free college programs. It only includes public. So we only included public colleges and universities because we kind of assume broadly that that's what the most broad sort of eligibility is. But in both cases, we modeled free college by adjusting the calculation of each institution's cost of attendance. So there is a difference between first dollar free college and also last dollar free college. First dollar free college covers tuition regardless of other grants and scholarships students receive, which allow students to use other aid towards living costs. And that makes a huge difference in the end, because as we all know, living costs have increased, and living costs are usually the that make up a lot of the cost of attendance. So modeling excludes tuition and fees from cost of attendance calculation entirely. Last dollar free college, these programs only cover tuition costs that remain after accounting for other sources of grant aid. Modeling reduces the cost of attendance by the amount of tuition and fees left over after accounting for other aid. So let's look at this modeling. So we look at a non-tuition costs as being 8,000, tuition and fees as being 2,000. So the total cost of attendance is 10,000. If the average grant aid is 1,500, that reduces the price by 8,500. So under a first dollar approach, we completely take out the tuition and fees, and we're reducing the cost of attendance down to 6,500, and that's the net price. In a last dollar approach, with our calculations, we're reducing it down to $500, and so 8,000 non-tuition costs plus 2,000 tuition and fees equals 10,000, but the 10,000 minus the average grant aid minus 500 remaining tuition is still 8,000 for net price. So it is going to be more expensive than first dollar approach. Just to give you a little bit about our missing data and our limitations with this, though, before I get into some of our findings. So for public, 4-year institutions with actual usable data was 528, which accounted for about 93% of public 4-year universities. Private nonprofit, we had about 82% of the private nonprofit 4-year universities. Public 2-year, 75%. As you'll see, the institutions with the least amount of usable data were for-profit institutions. So findings. This is status quo, so how institutions initially, without modeling the expansions, how institutions measure against threshold 0. So with the number of institutions with usable data, which is 504 total, median earnings meet or exceed T0, and then percentage meeting or exceeding T0. So undergraduate enrollment, we wanted to make sure that we were focusing on undergraduate enrollment in particular, because free college programs and were mostly affecting undergraduates. Okay, so here is some data. So how did public 4-year institutions do, right? The percent meeting or exceeding T0 was 99.3%. They actually did very well. Private nonprofit 4-year, 82.6%, public 2-year, 88.8%. We really found that overall, universities are and colleges and other types of institutions are doing pretty well at meeting that T0, but there is definitely room for improvement. So we then modeled the doubling the federal Pell Grant. So the number of institutions that would then meet threshold 0 under doubling that federal Pell Grant is an extra 95 with an enrollment of 610,925 students. For public 4 years, that is an extra 8. For private nonprofits, that's an extra 30 institutions, and so on down the list. Okay, and now we modeled first dollar and last dollar. So I'm going to start with first dollar approach. The number of institutions that would meet T0 under a first dollar approach is 44, which ultimately affected about 215,000 students. But under a last dollar approach, the number of institutions is only 3, which would then affect around 11,149 students. We're also doing some work on where this is sort of like post the report, but if a state or if an institution has a certain amount of monies or a certain amount of funds, how do they maximize whatever kind of program they can achieve? But ultimately are still recommending the last dollar approach. I mean, first dollar approach. Recommendations. First, double the Pell Grant, increase value for students from low-income backgrounds, reduce the cumulative cost of credentials. This is really important overall, is to think about the cost of attendance and how best to reduce it, because although universities are doing really well, we do know that there are some students who the cost of living has affected whether or not they can complete college. And so completing college will become more accessible if the cost of attendance is more affordable. So another way to do this would be investing in first dollar free college approaches, funding non-tuition costs like transportation or healthcare or childcare, avoiding narrow restrictions. So eligibility for need-based financial aid should be inclusive. So for example, sometimes low-income students who can only attend part-time and who need these funds the most don't qualify because they would have to attend full-time. Or if they're transferring institutions, there are certain states who use if they're transferring and they have too many credits and they wouldn't qualify for some of these, so if they're coming back at a later date in their career, or if they didn't graduate from a high school within that state. So all of those eligibility requirements, we really need to think, how do we maximize these programs and kind of take all of those restrictions out of the way. Providing support for completion. So federal and state policymakers should fund completion support. Again, we found that these affordability programs will help with completion. And so on top of that, if you're also helping by providing other types of programs, it's going to be really important, because increasing the completion rates will always reduce the cost. Invest in 4-year pathways. There's plenty of free college programs that only allow for 2-year universities. We're saying go ahead and expand that to 4-year pathways as well. Disaggregate earnings data by race and ethnicity. One of the limitations was being able to disaggregate all of this data by race and ethnicity and getting a really clear picture overall of the type of student who goes to the institutions who maybe need the most support in terms of affordability solutions. And so providing that data is really important. Improving earnings data for non-completers. This is another pathway I think that would help this data and kind of help us to get a bigger picture again. Okay, so I'm going to pause there for questions. And I can fill out anything that was confusing or any questions that you have about the research.
Jen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to start with a few questions myself, and then we'll look at the question answers from folks participating. So feel free to put them in the Q&A box. I think you likely answered this, especially when you referred to limitations of data. But to clarify, this is publicly available data, is the only data you use for this report. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Great. And when you talked about sort of earnings data by geography, you're talking about at the state level. No geography was done at a different regional level. It was all state level.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was all state level. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Two clarifying questions and then a good clarifying question in the Q&A box. Was
Sure.
this modeling looking only at those who completed 10 years out or everyone? So was
So
it
only, yeah, only completers. Yeah. And that's one of the limitations that I feel like, and we kind of go over that in some of our recommendations, is thinking about how to best track non-completers as well.
Yeah, excellent. I'm curious about what made you pick modeling Pell and this first dollar, last dollar? Were there other models that you considered, or sort of what really drove you to those in particular?
Well, I think it's sort of like twofold. One, we do know that there's some momentum in doubling the Pell Grant as a policy, potential policy lever, right? And so thinking about those students who need it most, it's a really good sort of measure of low-income students who are currently at institutions. And we do know that the Pell Grant, in order to maximize it, doubling the Pell Grant would be a great way to increase the maximum use of those dollars. And also it kind of fit these two solutions, these two affordability solutions work really well together. So it's really not a one or the other. I think, when you have the first dollar approach at the state level, then the Pell is kind of maximized because you're getting tuition out of the way, and then students can use the Pell Grant for other cost of living, right? So doubling the Pell Grant as well as like adding a first dollar approach to this, tuition is taken cared for, students who need it most, as like a kind of baseline measure for low income students who qualify for the Pell Grant can then use those dollars for other cost of living expenses. But also there are quite a few examples of state level first dollar and last dollar approaches to this. And so being able to kind of look at what is already out there and how do we model that is also just very helpful. So I think, of course, there are other kinds of affordability solutions that are available to us, but with the data that we had and with the momentum that we already see out there in policy field, we felt that those kinds of approaches are probably the best to model.
Thank you. Maybe this is something you haven't done yet, but curious as to whether those sort of double Pell, first dollar, last dollar, did you apply those to any other thresholds modeling? Like, did those efforts get any institution to threshold 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or is that just something you haven't done yet?
That's just something we haven't done yet. We've got case studies coming out. So this really helped us to think about like where our universities at now, right? And minimum economic return, of course, is sort of like baseline, right? How do we make sure that students get a return on their investment when they go to universities? But we do have a set of like case studies that we're working on that will be out early next year that will help us to kind of fill in the kind of narrative and the stories around universities that are already doing well, right? And in those case studies, we did apply some of the other thresholds in our like methodology in which institutions we were going to choose. But in terms of like modeling the Pell Grant or modeling first dollar approaches, we haven't done that work on the other like thresholds yet, and how that would affect the other thresholds. But that I think is probably a long-term goal, and I think in order to do that kind of work, we would need better data.
Sure. Wanted to go to a question in the chat, and it might help if you pull your slides back up, actually.
Sure.
Someone asked about those 44 colleges and threshold 0, and maybe just like unpack the findings a little bit more. I'm not entirely sure which slide that was, but if you go back to some of those findings.
It might have been was it with the first dollar, because there was 44. Let me go through this again, and then. Okay, we're just gonna do it this way. I think it might have been under. So it was findings.
Yeah, if that question has clarification, feel free to put it in the Q&A box. But yes, maybe it is the first dollar, because they did note the slide about 44 colleges and threshold 0.
Yeah, and that would be first dollar approach, I think.
Okay,
is probably what they're saying. Yeah.
So would you mind bringing that up and we can look at it?
Sure. Right. Okay. So I think what maybe they're asking is like, how did we get this 44, or what does this mean in terms of 44 institutions doing well? So basically what we did was we modeled that first dollar approach using those calculations. And we saw that institutions who had not met threshold 0 under the status quo now met threshold zero under this first dollar approach, right? And then compared to the last dollar approach, so if we then go back to the status quo, we model a last dollar approach using those calculations, only 3 then reach threshold zero under a last dollar approach. Some of this data, again, is limited. So we only did this for public 4-year and public 2-year or less, because a lot of these programs for like first dollar or last dollar approach are only available to public institutions. So that's one thing why the number of institutions is kind of low. Another reason is, we would love to be able to do kind of granular data or have better data in order to do this kind of work. But we do know that it does improve outcomes for affordability for students. So if hopefully that answered, if not, then I can definitely, if there's a more specific question, I can definitely go into that.
Great. Another question, how many schools do a first dollar versus last dollar versus nothing at neither?
Okay, that's a really good question, because so we did go through a certain amount of states to look at what their eligibility, like what their requirements were and how their programs, function. There are a lot of states who offer that last dollar approach. New York is one of them. I live in New York. New York is one of those states. There are plenty of other ones. Indiana, Missouri. I'm trying to think of all of them on the top of my head, but there's a lot that have that last dollar approach. However, one state in particular does have a first dollar approach, and that's New Mexico. This is a recent bill that was passed. The first year, so it was passed in 2021, and the first year has been like in 2022. So data coming out is very limited right now. We're not exactly sure, how it's improved. We definitely know that it's improved enrollment in New Mexico universities, but outcomes and completion rates and all of that I think we're going to have to wait a while to see how it's affected those students. But New Mexico is a great example. We hope to be doing a couple of maybe a piece on that to like talk about what their program is like, how it's like, so one, I'll just kind of give you what the criteria is. One, even though it's available to all New Mexicans who have a high school degree, so you don't have to have a high school degree in New Mexico. You don't have to be like, basically the only requirement is you can't have more than 90 credits of a bachelor's. So if you went to school 10 years ago, you want to come back, you want to complete, that's fine. You just can't have any, more than 90 credits. But what's really great is that it is targeted towards adult learners who are coming back and trying to finish their degree, because they've got these other types of programs as well. This one is called the New Mexico Opportunity Scholarship, but they also have what's called a lottery scholarship, and that's mostly for folks who are just right out of high school. So you've also got like several different pathways of funding. So even though like if you are right out of high school and you're 18, you can apply for this line of funding. If you don't complete a degree, you go into the workforce, you want to come back and complete it, you can apply for this type of funding. And this is a first dollar approach. It completely gets rid of tuition and fees. And it's for credentials, so you can do from like professional credentials all the way through a 4-year degree. So it's probably one of the most expansive programs in the US right now.
Thank you for that. And just a clarification that came in, schools cannot choose their approach. That is a state regulated.
Yes. Yeah. Schools cannot choose whatever the approach is. It's state regulated, correct?
Yes, great. That was a great clarification question.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Great. Okay, we're winding down, so I'd love to end with, is there something that really surprised you, or something that you learned that surprised you while you're doing this report?
Yeah, I mean, I was pleasantly surprised that overall universities are doing really well. I mean, especially public, 4 years and 2 years, they are, doing really well. And I think in order to help students who need it most, these types of affordability solutions do have a great impact, and I love that. And I think that these are policy levers that are doable and that are already have like momentum behind that. But yeah, I would say that I was very happy with at least the status quo results.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen. I have launched a quick poll. If you all would take it before you sign off, I wanted to thank Jen for participating today. I wanted to encourage us all to dig into this report, and we will send it out to everybody who registered again, along with the recording. But again, thank you for joining us for part of your lunch hour. Thank you to Dr. Garcia Kendrick. Thanks to everybody. Take that poll for us if you don't mind, and then enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. So thank you all.
Thank you so much.